most recent national census offers some interesting insight into how Canadians live, or at least where they live. Here's a look by the numbers. Based on the 2021 census, it is clear Canadians still favor home ownership over renting at 66.5%, but that's down from a peak of 69% in 2011 as more of us became renters. In fact, the growth of those choosing to rent was 21.5% in the 10 years leading up to 2021. Renters are occupying a big percentage of new homes built. 40.4% of units built in the 5 years up to 2021 were rentals. And in 2021, 73.2% of building permits issued were for rental units. Those renters, meanwhile, are increasingly likely to be millennials. 36.6% of the newly built homes between 2011 and 2021 are occupied by renters in this age group. The good news is that overall affordability has been improving, with households spending 30% or more on rent dropping from 24.1% in 2016 to 20.9% in 2021. Of course, that was thanks to COVID-era supports and increased incomes, and it was before interest rates began to rise. With the official start of fall this week comes new worries about what might happen to COVID case counts as the weather cools and people gather indoors. Far from being vigilant, though, to a new wave, it seems the fashionable thing to do is act like COVID has been beaten. Dr. Fahad Razak was the science advisor to Ontario's now disbanded COVID-19 Science Advisory Table. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
So I want to start with whether you think it's a bit premature to call the end of the pandemic. Are we a bit complacent right now?
I do think it's premature. I think all of us hope that it truly was over at this point, but we can still see significant problems. We had a huge amount of infections occur this summer across Canada, across the world, really, as the BA.5 wave was resurgent. We also are seeing a lot of dysfunction in our healthcare system. Unlike prior waves, where it was principally because of very sick patients ending up in the ICU, we're seeing the different ways that this virus and the pandemic can cause problems. Staffing problems, for example, have been rampant across the country. In addition, we still have a lot of infections occurring, and we do have to worry about conditions like long COVID. So would love for it to be over. Unfortunately, the data tells a different story.
And I guess one of the questions we have to ask is whether we learned enough from the heart of this pandemic. If another wave comes, if, God forbid, another virus should come, an entirely new pandemic in the future, what would we do differently? And I guess, do you think my question to you is, are we doing the forensic analysis that we would hope we would do to say, you know, the lockdown should have been X many weeks, or we shouldn't have locked down at all, or we just should have worn masks? Are we doing all of that work?
I think a lot of the work still has to be done. Some of the significant analysis that have looked back so far have identified a lot of problems. The Lancet, one of our leading medical journals, convened an expert panel that looked at the global response, and it includes high-income countries like Canada. And there was a lot to be desired. So it ranges from everything from vaccine access to our ability to control infections among the most vulnerable groups. So there is a lot to learn still. My hope is that there will be a recognition that we're heading into a fall and winter that could be very challenging, not only because of COVID, but because of the resurgence of other known viruses like influenza, and that we'll take the appropriate steps to protect our healthcare system.
Many will now be headed to their fourth, if they're old enough, maybe even fifth shot of a vaccine. Some will not. Do we expect to be taking some form of vaccine for COVID-19 indefinitely? How long will this go on?
Certainly right now, given the pace of mutation and the loss of immune protection that we're seeing within people, it looks like we're going to require vaccines at least initially for the time to come when looking over the fall and winter. Now, whether long-term this stabilizes into a pattern like influenza where it becomes an annual vaccine or something different, I think remains to be seen. But right now, what we're seeing is the vaccines are very effective against protecting against severe disease. They lose their effectiveness against symptomatic illness within a few months. And that symptomatic illness can still cause a lot of problems. Like I said, work and school absences, long COVID, disruption to healthcare delivery, and other industries as well, which are seeing staffing disruptions. So we are still seeing the ability of the virus to cause a lot of problems, even though the vaccines do look like the protection against severe illness is pretty strong.
Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
Good to be with you, Amanda.
Dr. Fahad Razak from St. Michael's Hospital, former scientific director of the Ontario COVID-19 Science Advisory Table. As the government moves to lift pandemic-era border restrictions, experts on disease control say those restrictions had very little positive effect when they were in place. That includes masking on planes. What other lessons will we learn and adjust our behavior accordingly? Livio DiMatteo is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and a professor of economics at Lakehead University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Amanda.
So when we measure the costs and consequences of the pandemic, we can obviously do two big buckets, Livio. One is the health bucket, how many deaths, and the other one is the economic consequences of our actions. It's very hard, of course, to try to measure those equally or place any equality on them. Health generally comes first for most of us. When we look back, though, can we start to say what worked and what didn't, and are we asking the right questions?
Well, those are very good questions. If you look at the entire period of the pandemic from January 2020 to January 2022, that 2-year period saw a lot happen in terms of incidence, mortality, especially at the front end. I mean, the alpha wave was probably the most challenging given the novelty of the coronavirus and the difficulty in trying to understand what to do. Mm-hmm. And it's had serious economic impacts. You had large drops in GDP in the second quarter, particularly of 2020, large drops in employment. I mean, in the span of a couple of months, Canada lost almost 3 million jobs. Our employment level went down to what it was like in 2005. But then recovery set in. But the recovery varied across the provinces over the course of 2 years. Some have done better than others. Some have also done better than others in terms of the incidence and mortality. So if you look at sort of the initial hit of the pandemic in terms of employment, Quebec was very hard hit in the beginning. The other provinces not as hard hit as Quebec in terms of incidence of pandemic. Saskatchewan, Alberta were hit hard. Ontario tended to have some of the most stringent pandemic restrictions. In the second and third waves of the pandemic, it had something like a 40% decline in retail. So, I mean, there was no one size fits all. All the provinces, in a sense, had their own response to the pandemic to their public health officials. But if you sort of look at the end of 2 years, some provinces do seem to have lessons for the others, although it's still difficult to know what exactly the lessons are.
So
I mean, in terms,
I guess one of the questions that we have to ask, because it could come up again, is did lockdowns work? Did we get that right? And as you say, we actually in Canada alone have a patchwork response that you can kind of look at and try to measure. Are we even asking those questions is what comes to my mind, Livio. We may get another wave. In theory, we could have a whole other pandemic in the future. Are we actually doing the analysis we should be doing to say, this worked, that didn't, we're not going to try that again?
Well, to be quite frank, if another pandemic happens, I would expect the response to be quite similar. Mm-hmm. The virus is novel and you really don't know what it involves or how lethal it is. Lockdowns are the automatic response in the absence of a vaccine. Then the question is, how quickly do you adapt? And some provinces seem to have adapted much more quickly. Consumers and firms often adapted more quickly than governments. The entire shift to online shopping and pickup, for example, of orders, happened pretty much independently of anyone telling them they had to do it. I mean, if you had to keep your business afloat during the pandemic, you had to adjust. So, the lessons are going to be unique for each pandemic. It's just like generals are always fighting the last war. Yes. I suspect public health officers will always be fighting the last pandemic. And that is going to be a fact going forward.
Livio, so good to have you with us. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Have a good day, Amanda.
Livio DiMatteo is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and a professor of economics at Lakehead University. Coming up, a perfect storm for restaurants as food prices continue to soar and workers are MIA. But first, this. We had to weigh in on the Toronto Maple Leafs' new sponsored jerseys, bringing to fruition an era of ads on team sweaters that NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman once said they'd be dragged kicking and screaming into. Well, don't kick the milk over. Dairy Farmers of Ontario will have a logo on the jerseys in return for sponsorship. In this mercantile world, maybe everything is for sale, but we can't help but wonder if the jokes will just write themselves and have the perennially losing Leafs accused of crying over spilt, well, you know. We're back after this.